Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Pally Threads. Today, I want to talk about the Canadian settler colony and how it's nearing its end. There is a report that was released last year by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, which is like the equivalent of the FBI in the United States, that says that it's expected that Canadians are going to revolt any time now, and it's expected within the next 5 years that the situation is going to deteriorate extremely, mostly because of the situation revolving around affordability crises here in Canada. For instance, it's expected that 35-year-olds in this country won't be able to buy homes. It's incredibly difficult for people to rent, to be able to have a place that they can call home. The homelessness is increasing and the healthcare is deteriorating in this country. And now I want to take us back to have a look at the foundation of this settler colony, but also other points, such as what the Canadian government is doing today and whether it's mitigating the rapidly deteriorating situation or if it's only accelerating it, which I believe is the case. So let's have a look. Canada is a settler colony like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Israel. A settler colony is the establishment of a colony that involves the movement, the settlement of people from another location. And this often requires a displacement of the indigenous habitants of the land or their murder, which is what happened here on Turtle Island. Now, I'm not going to dig too deep into the exact definitions of settler colonialism or the history of Canada's settler colonialism, the residential schools, all of this is a subject for another day, but the focus is that this is the foundation of Canada. And the Confederation, which is the unification of all of the different provinces, territories of the Canadian state, this happened, the foundation of this was on building a railroad connecting these different provinces for economic prosperity. So the linking of this state was not based on culture, was not based on history, but rather it was based on economic prosperity for these different provinces uniting together. Now, if this is the foundation, should these provinces not benefit economically by being united, or should they deem it not beneficial for them to be united, then this foundation is gone. If the foundation behind Confederation is gone, then Confederation is done, the Canadian state is done. And that is exactly what is happening. As the economic situation of Canada deteriorates, so does the entire state's existence. It deteriorates to a point where it does not exist. But also, this is commonplace in history. Borders change, states come, states go, but even more so with the settler colony. For instance, you cannot compare Canada to a state like Italy with deep history, culture. The population there is indigenous to that land. So if the country goes through severe economic turbulence, yes, people will go and seek opportunities elsewhere, but in the end, they are rooted to that land and a lot of people won't leave it. Whereas Canada, people come here for economic prosperity. They're not coming here because they want to go far away, somewhere cold. And no, because there is a vision that they can work, they can purchase a home, they can have access to good healthcare, pensions. But if this disappears, then the reason for people to live here in a land that is not theirs, where there is no history for them to it, and I'm not saying history of 200 years ago they came and killed indigenous people, that is not history that keeps you rooted to a land. The people did that because they're robbing indigenous inhabitants here and are trying to rob their wealth and live rich. But if they're not living rich, then it's the collapse of the state. So, the Canadian government, it's only worsening the economic crisis and really digging its own hole. And the RCMP basically acknowledges this because a lot of these economic issues are the government's doing. For instance, I want to focus on military spending. If the railroad was what was unifying these provinces back in the 1800s, that is not the case right now. Yes, we use the railroad, but we have other important means of transportation and ways to keep the economy going, and a almost 200-year-old railroad is not what's gonna keep holding the country together. So I want to talk now that like a big part of Canada digging itself in a hole comes from the influence of its southern neighbor, its fellow settler colony, the United States. The United States has been increasingly influencing the decision making of the settler colony's government in Ottawa. And so when I talk about this, for instance, if you look back at the early 1900s, the Canadian state had a lot more influence from the British government, stronger ties with the British state. But increasingly, this shifted over to the Americans. But still, Canada had a strong sovereign decision making when it came to various matters. For instance, Canada recognized Cuba as an independent state and refused to stop trade with it despite demands by US President John F. Kennedy. And the conservative prime minister at the time in Canada, John Diefenbaker, even doubled trade with Cuba, antagonizing the United States. And Canada, under the conservative prime minister, did its biggest wheat transfer to China at a time where China's population was starving to death. Canada did this despite US threats against the Canadian state to blockade Canadian ships. John Diefenbaker was also the first white leader that wanted to ban South Africa from the Commonwealth. And he also pushed for a nuclear test ban, and he was opposed to Canada joining the Organization of American States. Now, clearly, Canada was not aligned with United States foreign policies, and it was able to hold its own despite having a much smaller population than it does today. And I mention this because even though at the time Canada was also a settler colony and problematic, it continued to do what it felt was right, whether it's for itself, whether for the world in some instances. But I raise this issue just to highlight that Canadian leaders can, in fact, make decisions and for themselves, for their state, but they choose not to. And so the next thing I want to talk about is how the CIA, in response to the Canadian Prime Minister Diefenbaker antagonizing the United States, ran a disinformation campaign against him in the following Canadian elections and allowed the Liberals to win. And when the Liberals won, it was Pierre Trudeau that won, and he was even more antagonizing to the US. So the US kind of shot itself in the foot. Pierre Trudeau was personal friends with Fidel Castro. He was opinionated, influential, and really frustrated the Americans. Another important point is that Canada, as I mentioned, people come here, settlers, for economic prosperity, for opportunities. Often they leave their home countries because they're not doing as well and they expect something better. So Canadians are committed to capitalism. In the words of certain political scholars, Canadians worship wealth. And Canada as a country is controlled by corporations. And it's reached a point almost where it seems there is no point of, we're at a point of no return. So, for instance, we look at Canada's former Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who was a part of a lobby group called Canada 100 Million. And so Canada has long pushed to have a population of 100 million people. And this is simply because they want a big workforce, not just necessarily to counter the United States by having a larger population, but having a lot of cheap laborers. And the reason Canada has such a open immigration policy is bringing a lot of people who are going to take the cheap labor and willing to live in very poor working conditions. By the way, people often talk about Dubai in terms of slave labor, the Gulf countries, but you can look into Canada and we bring workers from the Caribbean, Mexico, other countries for cheap labor in our agricultural industry or other industries where they're denied rights, minimum wage, terrible housing conditions, and a lot of these workers actually have been killed, especially if you look at what happened to them during the pandemic, and I encourage you to research more about this. So, continuing on the points of the Canadian state crumbling and what it has done now, well, Canada's economically in a very poor situation, but it shouldn't be. It's a very rich state. Canada has over 75% of the world's mining companies headquartered in Toronto. Canada has robbed the wealth of indigenous populations globally, one of the world's biggest oil producers, mines, diamond mines, nickel, everything. Okay, this state has plenty, and its population is around 40 million. It is not a large population for the second largest country in the world. So it really shouldn't be struggling financially. But where is this funding going that is causing its own population to be homeless, unable to access healthcare, and life expectancy that is stagnant or sometimes even seen as decreasing? The Canadian state is increasing military funding at an enormous rate. And we can look back to the 2015 Liberal election when Justin Trudeau was running for office against Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper wanted to buy the F-35 US warplane via Lockheed Martin, the US weapons manufacturer. And Trudeau promised he would not purchase the 65 F-35s that Stephen Harper wanted to purchase because they were not good for Canadian military needs. And that is true. Historically, Canada, when it purchased warplanes, it looked at planes that had two engines and other traits because Canada's land is very large, sparse. There's not a lot of air bases, and you need planes to be able to go long distances before needing to refuel. So the F-35 simply made no sense. In addition, they're very fragile because they're stealthy. They have fallen easily into the seas by multiple militaries that have purchased them. And they're just so expensive. Canada actually was looking more into a Swedish jet, where Sweden was going to transfer the technology so that Canada can restart its plane manufacturing program that it had a long time ago, the Avro-Aero program, which the US lobbied to end after World War II, and took all of the Canadian scientists and used them to further their own program and force Canada into buying US warplanes. But at the time, when Trudeau reopened, after getting elected, and reopened the process for the plane acquisition, there were reports that came and said, if Canada doesn't go with the US F-35 warplanes, it can spark a political crisis with the Americans because it would be the first time since the 1950s that Canada would choose a warplane that's not American for its fighters. So, of course, 8 years after Trudeau was elected, Canada elected to go with the same F-35s that Trudeau promised not to buy, not only going with the 65 that Harper wanted, but Trudeau added an extra 23, purchasing 88 of these fighter jets. But not only that, these jets would cost, I believe, over 70 billion Canadian dollars. Add to that the 15 warships, the Type 26 warships Canada's getting from the UK. That's also in a joint contract with Lockheed Martin, the same as the F-35s. And these will cost Canada, these 15 warships, $306 billion over their lifetime. So together, you combine the 15 warships, which, by the way, an Australian study found that these ships are slow and ineffective, and they're easy to sink because they're so slow, and we're spending so much money on them. Together, the warships and the warplanes that Canada's purchasing, which actually don't even meet our military needs, will cost the Canadian state almost $400 billion that they're giving to US weapons manufacturer Lockheed Martin. But it does not stop there. Mark Carney, who came to power astonishingly while Trudeau's polls were crushingly low, and it was expected that the Liberals would be blown out in the election, Mark Carney promised that Canada is going to have a strong, sovereign foreign policy. He is going to stand up to the Americans, to Donald Trump. But instead, what he's done since coming to power was bootlicking the Americans and Donald Trump. For instance, Canada has increased its commitment to NATO spending. Carney wants to spend 5% of Canada's GDP on defense. To put that in perspective for you, Canada's overall federal government budget was $449.2 billion in the years 2024-2025. And 5% of GDP will be about $150 billion. So that's more than a third of Canada's entire federal budget going on military spending. What is national security? What is Canada exactly defending? What threats? Our only border is with the Americans, who are probably the biggest threat historically to Canada. Military historically has been used to support US operations, and whether it's airstriking Libya, attacking Afghanistan, helping, although Canada was not involved directly in the invasion of Iraq, Canada helped the Americans in other indirect ways, such as securing the American routes in the sea for transporting weapons and other equipment to Iraq. Canada has also killed civilians in Syria and Iraq more recently. And so, in addition to its assistance of Israel and continued arms shipments to Israel, arms shipments to Saudi Arabia, the second biggest arms shipments to Saudi Arabia with its $15 billion contract of land armored vehicles that Saudi Arabia used in Yemen. So Canadian military equipment were used in the starvation of Yemenis. And now, more recently, also under Mark Carney, Canada is planning on spending $65 billion in a joint collaboration with US President Trump's goal of building this defense dome over North America. And this is the minimum. This is the least expected price cost, but it's expected this cost could balloon into the hundreds of billions of dollars for Canada alone, in addition to the 400 billion we're spending on the warships and jets. And add to that the commitment now to NATO defense spending. And add to that the 2 billion increase that the Canadian government just did for military salaries. And so people walking around don't really talk much about military defense salaries, or of military spending by the Canadian state. They like to talk about housing affordability, crises, all of these different factors. When you talk about the NDP, the Conservatives, the Liberals, come election time, why are these not factors that we talk about? Why are we still thinking that we need to spend more on military when the military spending that we're doing is actually going to support US military operations around the world to target and oppress countries that are trying to simply exist because we're going there to loot their resources in a unsustainable cycle. We're actually losing money and not spending this wealth on the population's healthcare in this land, indigenous rights, water, clean drinking water for indigenous peoples. And in the end, there is no security. The only security here is for corporations, weapons manufacturers. And that's what I want to come down to. When Canada talks about national security and who they're protecting, they are protecting corporations, weapons manufacturers. They're not protecting you. They are not protecting the ordinary person that is seeking healthcare. I am someone who supports donating. I want to pay taxes if it means my taxes are going to go for education, for healthcare, for whatever it may be, even if I'm not directly benefiting from it. I want my people, others, to benefit and for us to distribute funding for the welfare of the population as a whole. But that's not where my tax dollars are going. They are going towards military spending, over a third of our government's budget, to target other countries. And that's simply unacceptable. But it's also leading to the suicide of the country. And the federal government, through the RCMP as an example, knows this. But it is continuing down this hole. This RCMP report was from last year. But what has Mark Carney done other than to continue to fall and make deals with the Americans? And Mark Carney can do different. We have seen in the past that the Canadian prime ministers have done different. That comes at a cost, but it is clear he is not there for the interest of his people. He is there for the interest of corporations, and that is who you elected. Not that there was any good alternative, because the NDP now is also pro-NATO and cowardly, as are all the parties. But in the end, it doesn't matter, because it is inevitable that all settler colonies are going to collapse at one point or another. And the Canadian settler colonies collapse is going to come alongside the American settler colonies collapse and Israel's collapse. And in the end, there is liberation for indigenous populations all around the world. I wish to add, by the way, that we have seen signs of the disintegration of the Canadian state, whether it's with Quebec's desire to separate, Alberta's desire to separate, with Danielle Smith really antagonizing the federal state. And so when I talk about, for instance, Quebec, why is Quebec part of Canada? Quebec doesn't want to be a part of Canada. For a long time, until now, I've lived in Quebec. So many people don't like this country. They want to be their own country. Although Quebec is a settler colony in itself. Like, they lost the settler colonial war, the French and the English, but they are on stolen indigenous lands, oppressing indigenous peoples on the land. But I can't imagine that once Quebec doesn't receive the equalization payments that it currently receives, that when Quebec isn't profiting by being a part of this confederation, that it will remain a part of it. Same with other provinces. Also, polarization, white nationalist, far right groups, terrorist groups active that are making plots to overthrow the state, to target facilities. And all of this while the federal government continues to target indigenous populations as security threats, when the security threat is not coming from the indigenous populations who this is their land and they want what's best for this land. They're allowing groups to thrive that seek the destruction of this land and are threatening the safety of people on this land. In the end, I don't know exactly what the future looks like once the Canadian settler colony falls apart. What if it's different provinces becoming their own countries, and then there is liberation struggles by indigenous groups in each of these provinces. Some provinces come together to become a country, some don't. What happens in the United States, because I see a domino effect happening, but it's something to keep tabs on. It is happening while the Canadian government tries to hide things and build a Canada strong and proud Canada in the face of the US threats against Canada. But really, Canada is just weaponizing and using that to try to keep Canadians holding together and accepting poor conditions that are really created because of decisions by the federal government over many decades, refusing to invest in the population of the country, but rather prioritizing corporations. But in the end, that's the foundation of this country. It is a capitalist settler colony. And national security, again, is the security of the wealth of the state. It tried to invade Jamaica and other countries. It has invaded other countries. Thank you for listening. I look forward to talking more on this subject, but I'm going to touch and I hope to connect with activists from the Western Sahara and Palestinian activists and other causes. I want to talk about different issues, but I think this was a really crucial topic to discuss as it is ongoing and my perspective as a Palestinian settler living here in this colony. So, thank you for listening. Take care and catch you soon.